Welcome everyone. So happy to have you all here. This is the January installment in the third season of the Religion and series sponsored by the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. The goal of the series is to create a space for thoughtful and engaged conversation at the intersection of religion and American studies. In these times, we need safe harbors to engage and unpack questions about the relationship between cultural transformation in North America and the category of religion. For the last 33 years, the Center, its journal, and the Young Scholar Program has been just that. It's brought together scholars and practitioners to think deeply about religion and its relationship to the most important questions in our fields, on our campuses, and throughout our society. The Religion and series was created with the same goal in mind, to facilitate conversations among leading academics and thinkers who are making critically important interventions. Every third Thursday at 8 Eastern Time, we discuss a topic that's the relationship between religion, the pressing issues of our day, and their impact on the fields we study. Today, we'll discuss the theme of religion and humor. From stand-up comedy to satire we watch on screen and stage, religion often provides rich source material for humor. At the same time, many Americans learn about religious people, ideas, and practices through humor. Important cultural touchstone, humor serves as a medium through which groups articulate religious identities and become socially legible, and through which the public develops their understanding of not only particular groups, but religion overall. We're so glad you could join us for a lively discussion with a panel of experts on Catholic, Muslim, and Jewish humor, and explore the fascinating relationship between religion and humor in American popular culture. Because our event is focused on conversation, we want to hear your questions. As I mentioned earlier, please share them. You can use the Q&A feature, and that will help us to sort of attend to those questions that we want to respond to. Before we introduce our panel, I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Krista Longton. I'm an Associate Professor of Communication Studies at IUPUI and an Assistant Dean for Faculty Affairs, Professional Development, and Diversity within the Indiana University School of Medicine. I was asked to serve as a facilitator for this panel in part because I use improvisational theater and improv techniques to study communication as it relates to the education environment, particularly in health and science. So I'm so excited to have this panel of amazing women today to really talk about these really interesting questions and the great work that they're doing. So here are our panelists in alphabetical order. Stephanie Brehm is an administrator scholar at Northwestern University. After earning her PhD in religious studies at Northwestern in 2017, she published America's Most Famous Catholic, according to himself, Stephen Colbert, and American Religion in the 21st Century with Fordham University Press in 2019. She currently works as an administrator in the graduate school, teaches in the Master's in Higher Education Department, and mentors undergraduate women in a residential college. Her research uses ethnographic and media studies methods to explore the intersection of entertainment, mass media, and religion in the 20th and 21st century American society. Welcome, Stephanie. So happy to have you with us today. Our second panelist is Jenny Caplan, Dr. Jenny Caplan, who is an assistant professor in the Jewish Foundation of Cincinnati Chair in Judaic Studies at the University of Cincinnati, just down the road from us in Indianapolis. Her research focuses on American Judaism and popular culture, and her first book, Funny, You Don't Look Funny, Judaism and Humor in the Generation to Millennials, will be published in 33 days, exactly, by Wayne State University Press. So exciting. Congratulations. Her current book project, Unmasked, is on Jewish identity and comic books. She earned her PhD in religious studies from Syracuse University. And finally, Samah Choudhury. Did I get it right? I worked so hard. Is an assistant professor of religious studies at Ithaca College. Her research surrounds Islam, humor, and the politics of social legibility in the United States. Her current book manuscript, American Muslim Humor, looks at the ways that Islam and Muslims are articulated through stand-up comedy and how they speak back to broader transnational practices and discourses of race, masculinity, and secularism. She holds a PhD from UNC Chapel Hill in religious studies. So welcome again to our three panelists. We're so very happy to have you with us today. I've got a few questions for each of you, and I'm going to do my best to monitor the Q&A so that we can make sure to get to some of our participants' questions as well. But I think for the first question that I've got, Stephanie, I'll start with you, and then maybe if the other panelists would like to respond after Stephanie, I'll welcome you to do so. So our first question is kind of a broad one. How is religion present in humor in American popular culture? And as you think about this question, I'll encourage you to think about different media, film, television, novels, and give specific examples from your research. So Stephanie, why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Thank you so much for having me on this panel. And this is a really great question to open the conversation. So thinking about examples in the realms that I study, which I study Stephen Colbert before The Late Show, so on the Colbert Report, so when he was doing his satirical character. And thinking about it that way, religion is present in his humor and his satire really as an identity marker. And I think that goes for a lot of us and how religion is presented. But it's also that because it was a news show, the Colbert Report, when religion would become part of the news cycle in mass media, Colbert would pick up on those themes that were present in the news and then expand on them, especially if they were Catholic, if they had a Catholic valence to them, or if he could reframe it using his identity. So I think that part of it, for example, in 2011, on Ash Wednesday, Colbert came on the Colbert Report wearing ashes at the beginning of Lent. And he also used his religious identity as a marker for himself, but also a way to demonstrate his insider status. So I'm going to read a brief quote from when so in 2011, he gave up Catholicism for Lent and tried a bunch of other religions, as one does. And so he then went on a Catholic bender. And this is, to quote Colbert, the Catholic bender that he went on. Well, long story short, I went on a Catholic bender, and I don't remember a lot of that weekend. I tell you folks, I got totally pious-faced. I did every station of the cross. I don't even remember how many sacraments I did. For all I know, I'm celibate now. I vaguely remember doing a Hail Mary and an Our Father at the same time. That's right, the Catholic speedball. So end quote. So as we look at that sort of Catholic bender, he's using the language of his Catholicism to mark his identity, but also make legible to others what it would mean for a Catholic to have a Catholic bender, right? He's showing what, to outsiders, what an insider perspective is. So he's sort of playing with those spaces. I'll also note that in the examples that I use in my book, and thinking more about how comedians are using religion, they're often using it to demonstrate their values. So I think about Bill Maher and Religulous, right? Where he says that religion is ridiculous, according to him. And so he's finding examples and then using his humor to mock things that he finds disdainful. So I think part of it is marking one's values and demonstrating and presenting one's identity. So I'll let the other panelists take it from there.
I think that's a great place to start as well, that notion of identity markers and values. Jenny, do you want to jump in? How does that change kind of from your vantage point looking at those perspectives?
Yeah, I think everything that Stephanie said is really dead on. And some of my response to this question will actually probably come out more in the next question, because for Judaism, I think this, and spoiler alert, the next question, are kind of intertwined. But I did want to hop on this idea of identity, particularly with Bill Maher, because I think one of the elements with this combination of sort of religion and identity and comedy, I think that he encapsulates really well is the way that the claiming of certain identities and the kind of code shifting has a lot to do with it as well. Because Bill Maher, when he talks about his background, he's half Jewish, he's half Catholic, And he'll slide into whichever one of those identities sort of gives him either permission to make whatever sort of joke he is about to make, or gives him a more authoritative standing to critique a certain element of religion. So I think that that's also an interesting part of this as well, is looking at the way that people are leveraging their own identities to give them the platform from which to make their satires or critiques.
And I think that sort of notion of thinking about how the sort of multiplicity of identities for Marr in particular, in some ways serves him well as a comedian, right? Because he has sort of those multiple perspectives to pull from. And Stephanie has that portmanteau in the chat as well there for those that are interested. So let's go ahead and I don't know, Samah, if you want to add on to this one about your experience, particularly as we're thinking about sort of Muslim identities and how we see that showing in media and culture.
Yeah, I'll just speak to this very quickly because I think the identity piece, again, is so central here, but it functions really differently for Muslims. So when it comes to Islam and Muslims in the US, at least, the most prominent pop culture representations are actually in the comedy world. And in fact, that's actually what piqued my own interest in this topic, which is how is it that, like, at least during the years between like 2010 and 2020, representations of Muslims were most sustained and kind of vaunted in comedy, right? In the comedy world. Aziz Ansari at the time is selling out Madison Square Garden. He's just inked a deal with Netflix for his own show. He gets a Golden Globe for it. He's the first Asian American to win in the category. And then, of course, he's subject to that very high profile Me Too controversy. We also have Hassan Minhaj, who is similarly a mainstay on Netflix, starts off on The Daily Show. And then Kumail Nanjiani, who made a movie about his marriage to his wife, gets an Oscar nod for that. And then does what breaks the internet, right? When he gets really swole for a Marvel movie. So the representation for these men hinges on something really particular, which is religion, and in this case, Islam. But Islam functions through our like dominant definitions of race. Here I mean like a phenotypical difference that doesn't necessarily influence or have command over one's political or social views, right? That more than anything else, Islam really just makes people subject to Islamophobia or discrimination from racists. So in that way, humor and pop culture become a really interesting case study, I think, through which to ask questions like, okay, so what's at stake when we think about race and religion as being fungible, right? What gets left behind when we speak about these things as like a conceptual one-to-one overlay? Because those jettisoned pieces, I think, actually speak to much larger cultural problematics. And I can speak a little bit more about that as we move the conversation on.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that we'll get into that, and I appreciate you sort of kicking us off there. Jenny, I'm going to turn to you for the next question. And I want to talk about, we've talked a little bit about how comedians themselves sort of maybe demonstrate their identity or demonstrate their perspectives through those lenses. I'm wondering about sort of flipping that perspective and thinking about how the public understands religion through humor, or the role of humor in public understanding of religion. So would you like to start there? And then again, we'll let the other panelists jump in. So how does humor shape public understanding of religion?
Yeah, and I think that this is a really interesting question from my corner of this discussion, because it lets us sort of look at the ways in which Jewishness and Judaism are hard to separate sometimes, but are quite different, because Judaism, I mean, if we're somehow defining religion in some sort of discrete way, and let us not turn this webinar into we're all going to pretend like we can define religion. But if we're talking about religion in some of the terms like Stephanie mentioned, with Ash Wednesday and ritual practices and things like that, that's not necessarily super present in comedy in a broad way. But what we do end up having is there are certain religious events and experiences that I think have ended up getting an outsized sense of importance to the American public as a whole, because they're the ones that show up in comedy. So in particular, I'm thinking that there's lots of comedy about circumcisions, because men really like talking about their penises. And there's lots of comedy about bar and bat mitzvahs, because 13-year-olds are awkward and funny. And you get a significantly smaller, but a non-zero number of comedies about not funerals themselves, but the kind of Shiva practice. Because these are sort of religious rituals that lend themselves towards jokes. They're heightened, they have heightened emotions, and they involve bodies, and all the sorts of things that comedians can have ready access to. And so those become the sort of, if you know a Jewish ritual, you probably know about a bar mitzvah, or that about bris, circumcision. Even if you've never attended one, because those are the ones that come up in comedy. So those are the ones that come up in pop culture. So there's sort of this effect where people's sense of what Judaism is, not that any of those things aren't important rituals, but they're also not by any stretch the sum total of Jewish ritual, but they're the ones that people know, because they're the ones that we make jokes about, because they're the ones that comedians have like ready access to. And it's this kind of like self-replicating cycle where it just feeds itself. And so I think that's from my point of view, the way that the public understands Judaism, I think does have a lot to do with what shows up in humor.
Well, and it's sort of an essentialization of ritual, right? It becomes that sort of like, this is the marker of that sort of broader cultural experience, the broader faith experience. It, boiled down into these moments that again are clearly and to some extent, as you point out, easily portrayable in pop culture, because they do involve conflict. They, like you said, there are heightened emotions and so on. So I think that's very helpful. Other panelists, do you want to respond to this one? So that question again is, how does the public understand religion through humor? And I'll just kind of add on to that. How do you think maybe that's changed over time as you think about the religious perspectives that you study?
I can jump in here. I think the introduction of Muslim comedians to kind of this milieu takes on a lot of different issues, right? It takes on religion, of course. It's also taking on religion and gender, precisely because there's this presumption of humor's dearth among Muslims to begin with, right? So looking at the way that Muslim comedians then construct their comedy to speak to these issues of Islamophobia, or the experience of being a minoritized person, the experience of being a man or a woman, right? Even if they're not challenging these hegemonies, or maybe they're just pointing them out in their comedy, sometimes they're even outrightly championing them, right? That allows, I think, the researcher at least to think a little bit more about the power at play here. So in the context of my work, I'm writing a book that says that humor is actually central to the way that the public thinks about Islam. And I think that coupling shouldn't sound unfamiliar for us, right? Why is humor an avenue for legibility? We can ask that question. I think we do, right? But even before that, we recognize that there's this implicit relationship between Muslims and the question of humor, right? And maybe it's less of a relationship between them and more of the fact that Muslims lack a sense of humor, right? So that relationship, I think, especially in the last 40 years, is something that feels, and indeed has been made to feel, very natural, right? So Muslims are stoic, they're unfriendly, they're stubborn, they're quick to fly off the handle when you offend them. They just can't take a joke, right? And there's global flashpoints in our recent history that really undergird this assumption, right? We have what gets dubbed the Salman Rushdie affair in the 90s, the Danish cartoon controversy in 2005, the Charlie Hebdo shooting in 2015. And so all of these debates I have found are always kind of boiled down to like two persistent questions, which is, why is it that Muslims can't take a joke? And then immediately after that, does this mean Islam is not compatible with modernity? And so a lot of scholars have kind of like taken up that charge, right? People say, no, look to the earliest episodes of Islamic history for proof of Muslim humor. Others say, yeah, look at these, comedians who come out after 9/11. But it's this supposed kind of lack of levity, what we call a sense of humor, and how it's so central to how we, the public, define an ideal citizen in a secular world that also then gets wielded as a weapon when it's demanded from Muslims.
And just to jump off that, because I think that's spot on for, I find it really fascinating how that works with the Muslim community as well. But thinking about it from a Christian perspective, and I think what's changed in the past maybe 80 years or so in American religious history is thinking about why we have an expectation of seriousness of religion, right? Why do we need to take religion seriously instead of taking it humorously, right? What is it about this sacred profane binary that then gets put on others as like, well, you can't be funny about religion. That's sacrilegious, or that is not holding to these ideals of what religion is in Protestant, that, aren't realistic and not how people live their experiences either, right? We have these intellectual expectations of religion as a category that humor, people being funny about religion tries to chip away at. But then also as scholars, as we think about it, why do we suppose seriousness? Why do we presuppose that?
And then I just want to, jump back on that to say this is why I think this conversation is so interesting and so good to have, because of course this is the part of it where my perspective is so very different. That we don't really have a notion that Jews can't be funny about religion. Like, that's not a thing. You'd have to go back hundreds of years to make an argument that that's a thing. So it, like, the evolution of the relationship is just so different from our different perspectives.
And I think broadly speaking, the sort of evolutionary perspective is interesting here, right? Because it helps us to think about the way in which we live out our cultural practices today and how those are, how those not only change over time, but change in relationship to one another as well, which I think is really interesting. So I've got another question for the group, and this might, we'll see what direction this takes us before we jump into some of our participant questions. And Samah, why don't we have you take this one first? How does humor function as a means for religious groups to make themselves sort of socially legible? And that's something that you alluded to there, but I'd love to talk a little bit more about that, because I think it's going to get our other panelists as well into talking about some specific media examples, which to me is one of the most interesting things about this.
Yeah, definitely. So the book I'm writing right now is looking actually at how Muslims in Islam are being constructed through this medium of humor and stand-up comedy in the United States. But also kind of tacking onto that, how these articulations are then also upheld and diffused as an ideal American type of Islam. So I'm arguing actually that humor, this ability to take a joke, right, the ability to make a joke, that it's actually become a de facto principle of modernity, right? It's an admirable personality trait of the modern person. And it's really critical, I think, that we see how human modernity in a lot of ways, at least in the ways that Muslims are assessed, how they've come to stand in for one another a lot, right? That gender and race have played a role in that development. I think it's also the reason that we kind of keep returning to this tired premise, right? It's so persistent after each of these events in the 90s, in 2005, in 2015, arguably even, what's happened at Hamline University, right? Where Islam is kind of being pitted against modernity, but there's no desire to kind of comprehend why the premise of Islam and modernity being at odds is so naturally assumed at the outset. So I think centering humor, right, this idea of a sense of humor lets us see how minoritized Muslim subjects are able to kind of seize upon the notion, how they embody that notion in order to then create and find social legibility where they live. And so I don't think it's a surprise, right, that the three most popular Muslim comedians of the last few years are all men, that they're all South Asian, and that the version of Islam that they perform and authenticate on stage, that the ways that they talk about it are actually just interchangeable with the ways they talk about race and ethnicity. And so the articulation of Islam is one that I think, at least this articulation of Islam, is one the American imaginary really thirsts for, because in the logic that's being set out, Islam, like other good religions, is private. It's a matter of internal belief, right? It doesn't intrude on public life. It operates more or less like race, right? The only time it does have a public political implication is when these men are being subject to anti-Muslim hostilities and Islamophobia, right? So that means that they can make fun of the racists. They can ridicule, right, the kind of like lumbering banality that comes with, someone screaming, go back to where you came from, right? Because that is also, I think, then reifying Islam in what are frankly very Protestant Christian terms. So in that way, I think our kind of dominant understandings of diversity, pluralism, they're actually quite confined. Islam seems to only be legible. Muslims only seem to be legible and embraced when they've been made to fit those expectations and regulations of a very particular secular order.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to let others sort of respond to this question about social legibility, and then I've got maybe one more question before we head to some questions in the chat. So Jenny or Stephanie, would you like to sort of respond to that question?
Sure. So when I think about some Catholic comedians, I think about like George Carlin, and I think about Jim Gaffigan. Those are some of the Catholic men that I write about. And thinking about the social legibility, right? As Catholic Americans went from being Irish Catholic or Italian Catholic to, the racial component of like Mexican Catholic is still there's still some definite like racial things that make them not white Catholics, right? So as Catholics became more white, they sort of fell in with the other brands of humorists, other comedians. And so the social legibility for white men was able to be part of it. And so the Catholicism kind of became a funny little component, not the primary aspect of their comedy at all times, right? So they might be talking back to institutions with their comedy, but that's because they know institutions really well. They came from the biggest institution, right? Catholics. And so thinking about how those modifiers of Irish and Italian Catholics fade away, right? If we look back at, 2008 to 2015 or so of late night hosts, 7 of the 9 were Catholic or went to Catholic schools or grew up Catholic, right? It's like the Supreme Court. All of a sudden, everybody's Catholic and nobody knew when it happened. So because they were made legible by being white men, their Catholicism, they weren't papists. No one was going around calling Conan O'Brien a papist, right? But he still played his Irish Catholic heritage into some aspects of his comedy.
Yeah, I think it's nearly identical. From my part, it's the same sort of post-war Will Herberg tripartite Protestant Catholic Jew moment where Jews claimed their part of white American hegemony, and the humor, I think, was a big part of making them legible then. I think what's interesting and different from my point of view now is that in humor, Jews have maybe become slightly too legible. So we're having all the debates right now over like Jew face and the preponderance of people playing Jewish characters, especially in comedy where the Judaism is part of what's being joked about. And it's being done by non-Jewish performers and non-Jewish writers and creators. So there's almost this pushback now where Jewish comedians are attempting to sort of reclaim some part of that narrative and maybe say, well, actually, maybe we're not quite as legible as you thought, and there's more about us that you don't fully understand. So perhaps we need to take some of this back. So it's almost pushed back to the other side.
And humor sort of makes everyone appear equal when in reality there's a lot more complexity and multiplicity to groups than you with humor. You sort of need that instantaneous I can connect to an image of that. And so while sometimes humor allows for building on complexity and multiplicity and questioning, it sometimes doesn't. It sometimes goes directly to the stereotypes.
That's a really good point. And I'm actually going to kind of skip to another question that we have in our little Google Doc that we've worked on, develop questions, is maybe one of my last questions for you all before we jump to some great questions that we've got in the Q&A. And I was wondering if we could sort of transition. I know it's not all of your area of focus, so I'll just ask you to sort of speculate a little bit about the notion of digital culture and how sort of the ability to create, for the every person to create content may have changed the way that we think about religion and humor. We've spent a lot of time today talking primarily about men, and male comedians, but thinking more broadly about about some folks who in digital spaces, because we have to some extent made particularly video platforms. I'm thinking TikTok, Instagram, more accessible to folks. It becomes a sort of new platform to ask questions about the relationship between all different kinds of culture, but in this case, religion and humor. So I've opened to the floor, whomever would like to address that first, but how has digital culture like TikTok, memes, blogs, Instagram changed the way that we think about religion and humor? Looks like Jenny, you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. I think it's been a huge equalizer. In my book and in my research, I think about this sort of generationally. So I lump all of those together as elements of millennial humor and what will eventually be Gen Z Zoomer humor, but they're pretty young still. And I think that the openness of a lot of these digital platforms has allowed for so much more diversity in humor and people who can get themselves an audience. For everything from Miriam Esnoven's Daf Yomi reaction videos on TikTok to the fact that Broad City started out as a web series, to the fact that Amy Schumer started her career by being on a reality TV show. There's just been this massive change in the narrative of how you make yourself a career in comedy, and you don't have to go through the incredibly kind of toxic, gatekeeping, misogynistic world of the comedy clubs. You can still go that way, but there are so many other avenues that people who weren't comfortable in those spaces, especially women, for example, and Jews of color, and comedians who just didn't want to make their career through the clubs, they have so many other opportunities now because of all these digital platforms. And I just think that that's been such a huge benefit to comedy in general.
I will say, as a consumer of much of that comedy, I feel the same. There are so many spaces where I think there's just no way that this person would have made it onto the stage of a comedy club, and yet I find the content that they're creating. I think about the person who Insta says hippie era was one of my favorite comedians on Instagram right now, and so I think that as we think about sort of how we're changing who has access, and at the same time thinking about the idea that those digital tools are not available to everyone given the digital divide. Others on the panel want to respond to that, or any examples to share from your own work?
Sure. So I was thinking more about how audiences then worked with what Colbert was putting out there and thinking about how they were using that. And so there was a great meme that helped me sort of conceptualize, people always asked, was Colbert the character liberal or Catholic? Like, is Colbert as a human liberal or Catholic? And there was a meme that said, are you a liberal Catholic or a conservative Catholic? And it said, I'm a Colbert Catholic, right? So people are using digital media to align themselves with these comedians, or using those comedy examples to present themselves to the world and to find kindred spirits across platforms. So I was thinking more of it from an audience perspective as well.
And that's a great point. I mean, something that would not be available would be that sort of dialogue that happens between the audience and the star, in this case, if you will, that would look very different even 20 years ago. Absolutely. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say I agree very much with what Stephanie and Jenny have mentioned here. The men that I'm looking at are really kind of the last of a certain kind, you might even say, right? Where they did start off with putting up really grainy YouTube videos that they made with their buddies. back in 2004 and 5. But then did also go the requisite route of, the bowels of the LA comedy clubs, and the Comedy Cellar in New York. What digital media has done now, that I'm most interested in, is how accountable it's keeping these incredibly visible comedians. And it's accountable in ways that are both good and bad, right? There was this kind of dominant sensory grammar that emerged, I think, in the last several years that you'll recognize, where people talk about being seen and feeling so seen, right? That became this idiom through which viewers responded to the expanding opportunities that were being made to people of color, right? Or Muslims in this case, that they're being given on pop culture stages, and that these men have been the beneficiaries of that. So if you go to Twitter, other forms of social media, it's replete with examples of Muslims who are excited that someone like Hasan Minhaj would, sprinkle long sentences in Urdu into his set, right? That Aziz Ansari dedicated an entire episode of what was otherwise like a romantic comedy to the relationship with his parents and his relationship to Islam. There's a small moment in Kumail Nanjiani's movie that he doesn't even explain really, where he shows a scar on his shoulder from like a smallpox vaccine that like only folks, who were born and vaccinated in certain countries would recognize, right? And so that's something a lot of Muslim folks, especially younger demographics, find deeply meaningful. But it doesn't mean that they're also not being held accountable in ways that speak, again, to communities like women, communities like Black Muslims who certainly don't find the types of representation that they might want to see through these men's work. Hasan Minhaj came under fire by this kind of, at this point, he's like an elder statesman of Muslim comedy. His name is Preacher Moss. He took an issue with a bit that Hasan Minhaj did on his show Patriot Act, where he did a bit about, praying to God for the strength to not get distracted by Lululemon pants. And so, Minhaj later publicly apologized to him. Another Muslim comedian, Rami Youssef, has sustained a lot of critique for the way that he portrays Muslim women's experiences on his show, Rami, and particularly the experiences of Black Muslim women. And I'll say, too, Minhaj has been the subject to a lot of criticism for the kind of sexist environment that was found in the writer's room of his show. So that accountability piece, I think, is really interesting to think about and the future right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does, again, kind of create that shift in power that we see happening with lots of digital perspectives here. So I'm going to turn us over to some questions in the Q&A. I'm going to I've been trying to read them. This is such an engaging conversation. So my apologies to the folks in the audience. We'll try to get through as many of these as we can. One of our first questions for our participants asks, for a listener, how much knowledge about religion is needed to understand religious humor? And I think that's an interesting question, particularly when we think about the concept of understand, right? Understand to what end? So anyone want to respond to that? Sort of, maybe Jenny, we'll start with you, because that's one of the things that you sort of talked about early on, was that notion that for Jews, to some extent, there's that essentialization that happens in media portrayals.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. And I see that the question came from Joni Eisenstadt. So of the three, probably understand the most about Judaism. But she's a longtime friend of my dad's. But I think that particularly in terms of Jewish comedy, the shortest answer is none. And I think that that's part of why the overlap between Jewishness just as a state of being and Judaism as a set of practices is really important in conversations about Jewish humor, because I think that for a lot of the audience, Jews, we know, make up 2% of the American population, 0.2% of the global population. So nearly everybody has limited to ranging to no actual knowledge about Judaism as a set of ritual practices. And in the way that Jewish comedians tend to use Jewish identity, you really don't need to know much. But I think that it becomes a sort of insider type of humor, that the more you know, the more of those little references, like the smallpox scar, you know, the little throwaways that are not going to take away from your appreciation if you don't get it, but these tiny little things that the more you start to know, you pick up on, and you have a deeper or a different appreciation of them.
Yeah, I'll say that Colbert sort of acted as a catechist, someone teaching about Catholicism while he was on the Colbert Report, and I think we can argue on the Late Show as well, right? He brings on priests and nuns who are explaining aspects of Catholicism, and then he's also teaching others about Catholicism through his act, through the comedy and the satire. And so you don't need any information, but again, you get more of the joke if you have an insider understanding, or you know enough of the language to know, like, oh, okay, a mitre is the Pope's hat, right? Like those kinds of jokes make more sense if you are aware of some of those things. But I think a lot of that trading happens in stereotypes too. And so if you're aware of the stereotypes, you may get it may expand your understanding, or it could actually, depending on the audience, close it off, and then you just understand from a stereotype.
Yeah, I'll just add too that I think Islam does not suffer in the public imaginary of from being, you know, like mysterious and unknown. In fact, it's hyper visible, right? And it's a very specific dominant image that these men, in a lot of ways, the three men that I'm writing about at least, feel they have to kind of be these like cultural emissaries for. So Aziz Ansari, when he was tapped to host Saturday Night Live the day after Donald Trump was inaugurated, part of his SNL monologue was about how you don't need to be scared when you see a Muslim praying and speaking Arabic, because all they're actually saying is normal religion stuff. He says, you know, God is good. That's all they're saying. The reason people are scared, he says, is because folks always put that homeland music over it. So if you just change the music, everyone will see that Islam is just, he says, one whimsical religion. So there's a lot of kind of doing the public facing work of, you know, putting forth a good face for Muslims. But at the same time, I would actually say what Stephanie mentioned is very apropos, that it also is solidifying and creating another type of Islam that these men are, you know, absolutely not, which is that bad terrorist type.
That's a great point, that those stereotypes sort of have, as you see, you've all sort of illustrated, have the potential to kind of perpetuate in this space. And in some ways, if left unchecked, that's certainly something that creates concern. So let's take the next question that's from the Q&A. I'm curious about your thoughts on humor that's not used by someone who identifies as a part of the religions targeted, such as the musical The Book of Mormon. And Jenny, you talked about this a little bit as you were talking about Jew face as well, right? That sort of, you know, folks that are not, that might be, I'll say, visiting in a culture, in the case of the Book of Mormon, or so speaking for a culture, in the case of your example, Jenny. So what are some thoughts on this? How do we as a culture kind of have a conversation around these places where I would say audiences may widely not always ask a question in the way that our audience members do? What are your thoughts?
I don't want to keep being the first one to jump in here. But yeah, I mean, I think it is, I hesitate to say it's an issue because I think that's debatable, but it is at least a conversation that we have a lot in Jewish humor studies. And I really, these days, I think of it as the Mrs. Maisel problem, that so many of the major people involved with and the primary faces of the marvelous Mrs. Maisel are not Jewish. And so, you know, is that, I don't think that's a good thing necessarily. Is a bad thing. That's what I think is debatable, but certainly I do think that we need to at least be conscious of the way that people are laughing at versus laughing with, punching up versus punching down, like all of those sort of questions. I think that they're important when we're talking about especially minoritized religious groups. Stephanie, I'm sorry, but I don't think anyone gets as upset when non-Christians make comedy that mocks Christians. But the Book of Mormon, that's more of a border case because we're talking about a much more minoritized group. So I just think it's worth keeping an eye on.
And I think that question about, again, it goes back to power, right? That's that place that I think we come back to when we have those kinds of conversations. Other thoughts on that question, or we move to the next one? Again, I want to try to get to as many as possible. So let's take Kieran's question next. Is it ethical/moral to say that certain religious jokes or jokes in general are, quote, off limits? If we adopt that philosophy, are we not heading down a path in which we are limiting free speech, which we know can be very dangerous? So be interesting to hear folks' perspectives, and particularly because some of these have been high-profile cases, like we've talked about.
Yeah.
Who would like to start with that one? Go ahead, Stephanie.
I can start with that. Yeah. I don't think any jokes should be off limits. I think people should consider their audiences when doing these jokes, right? Who do you want your audience to be? And is this audience going to there are offensive things in the world, right? And do we give those a platform? And I think that's up for, I love the idea that Samah was saying about accountability. I think that's really where digital media has been helping with these issues, right? And opening up the conversation to more than just the gatekeepers that we had, say, Johnny Carson, right? For example, it's no longer one group of people that are getting to have these opinions, but I think that that there's definitely a space for, that there shouldn't be anything off limits. It's just, if we're thinking about this in terms of like markets and capitalism, people won't go see that comedian if they disagree, right? I do think there's a lot more harm that can be done to marginalized groups, but I think that there are audiences that will help make that, the reception aspect can help mitigate some of those things. But in general, the same way I think academic freedom needs to exist, I think humor freedom is just part of what we're looking at. But there will be controversies, and there should be. Jokes are not a long-lasting and everlasting. They are context and content specific, and audiences are able to then look at that, right? The same joke that was funny 100 years ago is not funny today in the same way. You need to understand the milieu around it to make it funny.
Yeah, I agree. You can go all the way back to Freud's wit and its relation to the unconscious, and it's about the relationship between the joke teller and the joke hearer. So I don't think any joke should be off limits, and I think that part of the skill of being a comedian and the job of being a comedian is knowing what's the right time for the right joke. So I absolutely think comedians should face all the hell in the world for making the wrong joke in the wrong place to the wrong people. But I don't think that means that the joke was the problem. I think that there were decisions that were the problem.
I'll just say real quick too that the premise of this question is really interesting, right? Because it illustrates what the limit is here, right? That it was named as, sorry, the question's not up there anymore. I was looking at the text of it, but that
my apologies, it's answered. If you just click that next one over, right. You'll see it.
Because the wording of it was useful, right? If we adopt that philosophy, are we not headed down a path in which we are limiting free speech, which we know is very dangerous, right? So you've named the limit here, and that what lies beyond the limit is dangerous. So who does lie beyond the limit, and does that make it illegible is a question that I think is really interesting. I liked the way that Jenny phrased it, that like we can see it maybe not necessarily, or frame it not necessarily as a problem, but it is a conversation. And I like seeing the conversation as it's playing out even just here.
Thank you so much for all of your comments on that. Let's see here. I think Joan has a comment. I'll sort of leave that there and ask this next one. How are the comics by Huda Fahmy? I'm not familiar with that comedian. Is a Muslim woman about hijab and marriage compared to the comedy of Muslim men. And this will maybe relate to that broader question, Aaron Kelly's question, kind of a couple down. There's definitely a theme in this discussion about men, religion, and comedy. Are female comedians just not bringing their faith, if any, to their work, or thoughts on that? So maybe we can take both of those together. And Samah, why don't you start here?
Yeah, sure. This is a great question. And I think the answer is no, that women are not unlike these men. But like we said, there's a reason that it's men who get the Netflix deal, right? Whom Amazon comes courting for a movie. For Muslim women comics in particular, this is a question I get frequently, right? Which is, why are you writing about men? Do Muslim women comics not exist? They certainly do. And they perform to, varying sizes of audiences, but again, they're not getting the access that men typically do, right? And we can point to a variety of reasons for that. You might recall, in the early 2000s, there was actually a public conversation about whether or not women can be funny. Do you remember that? Who wrote that article? It was Hitchens or someone, right? That then a bunch of people, tried to respond to, can women be funny? Something like that, right? The idea of comedy as an old boys club is not a contested one, I think. So in addition to that, Muslim women are also contending with the presumptions and stereotypes that are specific to Muslim women, not just being Muslim and just being a woman, but Muslim women specifically, right? And that chief among those stereotypes is that they are oppressed. So frequently, right? You mentioned here that Huda Fahmy's comedy takes on issues of hijab and marriage, right? It's in that context that Muslim women's oppression is typically discussed. I don't think it's any surprise that that's why she kind of foregrounds that in her comedy. It is more uncomfortable, though, than simply disavowing the bad terrorists and saying, look, I'm not like that. For her to disavow oppression, she would have to be disavowing the Muslim men who were doing the oppression. So I think that creates a different premise, which might speak to why Muslim women are not so readily embraced and then slapped on the front of, Netflix's Representation Matters collection, right?
Thank you for sharing your perspectives on that. I want to give the other panelists an opportunity to respond to that question about gender more broadly. Before I want to make sure that there was a couple of other questions we want to get to, so I'll ask you to keep your answers maybe a little bit short.
I just agree. The gatekeeping is what is keeping the women out of some of these conversations. There's, while there's some democratizing with digital media, it is not enough, and not in the more public spaces, one would say.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and that's why when I was talking about the digital platforms, like all of the comedians I mentioned there were women, because I do think that that's increasing the access. And also to Samah's point about women also having to overcome the stereotypes about them as women. For Jewish women in comedy, you have the kind of two-headed beast of the Jap, the Jewish American princess, and the Jewish mother, both of whom are like monstrous beings. So they have this kind of like, do they play into that because it's what's expected, or do they try to push against that because they're horrifying? And that makes additional layers of complication for them.
I'm going to jump around a little bit. I'm the moderator, so I get to do that, I guess. And I actually want to ask this question about change over time and as it relates to pedagogy. So it's from anonymous attendee, offers thanks for the discussion. I think I'm getting to an age where my own sensibilities to humor are very different than those of my students, and I'm curious how you think about humor as a pedagogy, particularly when platforms of and access to content is so rapidly changing. I teach our critical media theory class in our department as well, and also have some of those experiences, where even my clip of Hassan Minhaj, for example, is outdated for my students this semester. And so it's interesting to think about just how much content is produced and how we sort of continue this conversation in a way that helps us to move forward, given that we're consuming as quickly as we're thinking about things to some extent. So thoughts about how you teach about this, how you choose examples, that would be, I think, a little segue here. And Stephanie, why don't we have you start?
Yeah. I put a disclaimer in my syllabus that says I write about humor and really talking about the context and content that the way I'm going to be presenting jokes, and that, trying my best to, not necessarily a content warning, but an awareness that this is what is happening. And if you have different expectations, to come talk with me. And that's especially helpful for my undergraduate students when you were talking about religion, where they don't expect a non-serious aspect to the conversation. And I really like using them doing the footwork and finding examples. And so, what do use TikTok and find examples of religion in comedy and then bring it to class and present that way. It's not just me, right? Like when I do presentations on the Colbert Report now, a lot of my students were like 3 when the show started, and I have to have a moment of self-doubt and panic, but like they just don't get it. So it's better when they bring in the examples and we can discuss them together.
Yeah, I agree. Having them bring examples is really helpful, because I will admit, I don't understand Zoomer humor for the most part. I don't. And so having them bring in examples and having them talk about and break them down, it helps me better understand what's going on in the humor of the youths, because just on its own, I find it very strange and random and confusing.
Same for me. I let them take the lead precisely because when I first started this project, these men were maybe the folks that people were watching. Last semester, I had a student, just openly say it in class, where she says, she finds millennials so cringy and that it's its own brand of humor. And these men are definitely that. I guess I am too. But allowing them to, kind of take the lead. And that comes in the form of like TikTok videos frequently in my classes. Helps me try to understand it. But again, I also, I'm at a loss for Gen Z humor. I feel like there's never a punchline anymore, and it's really just morbid, but without anything funny at the end. But that's what's funny. I don't know.
I appreciate all of those perspectives. I feel the same way with my, one of the things I love doing with my graduate students is that space of co-constructing the syllabus, right? Sort of bringing examples in. I think, again, when we think about those the concepts of power and how they shape our classrooms, that, that's an opportunity there. Let's take this last question here. A discussion around comedy as a form of social legibility for religious identities is really interesting. But I'm wondering what y'all think about how neoliberal capitalist structures that surround comedy and in some ways its exceptionalism, how might these systems construct especially racialized subjects in terms of production, consumption, and palatability? It's a deep question, and certainly one, again, for my critical theory class that I could probably do a couple of on. What are your thoughts here? Again, it's that notion of consumption and power as it relates to many, the minoritized individuals who we've offered as examples in this space. I want to talk about consumption here.
I love this question. Thank you, Mihi. And I think it speaks precisely to at least the Hassan Minhajes of the world. In my class, when I teach my own work, I will usually start off with a clip of Jerry Seinfeld when he received some criticism for the first season of his show, Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, where folks, at least on Twitter and other social media, called him out for only having men on that first season. Jerry Seinfeld responds in a really angry way, where he says, gosh, it's like you think humor has to be the census or something. For me, he says, humor is about, or like comedy is about being funny. If you're funny, I'm interested. If you're not, I'm not. And I think that really encapsulates what Mihi is getting at here about consumption and production and accessibility, right? When someone like Jerry Seinfeld, who, is now not the young whippersnapper in the comedy clubs, but the kingmaker, says this, young up-and-coming comedians are going to mold themselves to that, right? Everyone is dying to get on Jerry Seinfeld's show, Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, right? That's a big opportunity for you. And that's just one example. I think we can extrapolate that out broader to see just much broader, bigger capitalist trends and exceptionalist trends as well.
Thank you so much for your perspective. I'm looking at the time and I think that we need to wrap up, but I just want to thank all of our amazing panelists. What a rich and powerful discussion that we had today. And I also think we had a little bit of fun, which I love. So thank you all for being here with us. There are some messages on your screen that I'll just underscore. You will get a survey. We would encourage you to give us some feedback. Stay tuned for Religion and Environmental Catastrophe on February 16th. And there was a question about this, so it's on the screen here. The recording of this webinar will be available on the YouTube page, as well as I believe it'll be available on Facebook afterward. Please join me in offering maybe a virtual applause to all of our amazing panelists. Thank you all so much for being with us today. And thanks to the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture for my opportunity to get to meet these amazing scholars. I really appreciate all of your engagement. Thank you so much.